People still think it was just a fight in a grocery store. They were wrong. By the time the truth came out, a respected businessman had been led away in handcuffs. His son had pleaded guilty to assaulting an elderly man. And an investigation that began in a checkout line had uncovered years of intimidation hiding behind polished smiles and expensive suits. But on that Friday afternoon, none of us knew any of that. All I knew was that my father's cane hit the floor before he did. It wasn't his body striking the tile that has stayed with me. It was the cane, a hickory walking cane he'd carved with his own hands the year my mother died. He only used it on mornings when his old knee reminded him he wasn't 40 anymore. When it slipped from his grip, it struck the polished floor of Vaughan Market with a crack sharp enough to cut through every other sound in the store. The scanners stopped beeping. The carts stopped rolling. Even a toddler 2 aisles over fell silent. Then my 73-year-old father hit the ground. He lay there, clutching his shoulder, more concerned with his dignity than his own safety. The man standing over him wasn't apologizing. He was smiling, not the embarrassed smile of someone who'd lost his temper, but the satisfied look of a man who believed he'd just reminded the room who was in charge. No one moved. A woman looked down at her cart. An older couple quietly backed away. The security guard near the entrance glanced over, hesitated, and found something else to look at. Then the man looked straight at me. "You got a problem, lady." He had no idea he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Not because I'd once worn a badge, and not because I'd spent 15 years as Bellwood's police chief. Because he had just laid his hands on the only parent I had left. Friday afternoons belonged to my father. Ever since retiring from teaching woodworking at Bellwood High School, Walter Dalton insisted on doing the Sunday shopping himself. He claimed tomatoes tasted different depending on who picked them, and that no one should choose a steak under fluorescent lights while in a hurry. "You buy food with your eyes," he liked to say. "I buy it with my hands." I never won that argument, and that morning had been no different. He'd insisted on driving. I'd insisted on driving, and he'd won. Again. After my mother passed 6 years earlier, I'd learned to measure love differently. Sometimes loving him meant letting his independence matter more than my convenience. The drive into town took 15 minutes, most of it spent arguing gently about my granddaughter's new softball glove, him certain it wouldn't last the season, me certain he thought better tools solved everything. He sounded exactly like himself, opinionated, gentle, certain the world would improve if people simply slowed down long enough to do things properly. Looking back, it's the ordinary conversations that hurt the most. Nobody tells you the last normal morning is the last normal morning. Inside, everything felt familiar: fresh bread from the bakery, a watermelon display that looked one nudge from collapsing country music drifting quietly through the ceiling speakers. We stopped twice because people recognized him, Mrs. Collins thanking him for fixing her porch railing after the ice storm, a young mechanic asking if he still had time to help rebuild an old rocking chair. He always found time for people. That was simply who Walter Dalton was. Above the registers hung a large green sign, Vaughan Market, and beside it a framed photograph I'd walked past 100 times without really seeing two men in matching aprons, arms crossed, standing in front of the very entrance we'd just come through. Underneath, in gold script, "Serving Bellwood for 40 years, the Vaughan family." I'd shopped there for years without giving it a second thought. At that moment, it was still just another grocery store. We joined the shortest checkout line. Only one customer stood ahead of us. Emily, the young cashier, scanned our groceries with the kind of polite efficiency that made you forget she was probably exhausted. Dad watched every item appear on the screen the way he watched everything carefully. "Sweetheart," he said, "I think those peaches were scanned twice." Emily checked the register. "Oh, you're right, I'm sorry." "It happens." The correction took less than 30 seconds. Behind us, someone sighed. Loudly, then again. "For heaven's sake." I glanced back. The man behind us stood well over 6 feet, mirrored sunglasses pushed up on his head despite being indoors. 3 items in his basket: protein powder, energy drinks, beef jerky. His watch probably cost more than my first patrol car. "If people can't keep up anymore," he muttered loud enough for the whole line to hear, "maybe they shouldn't shop during rush hour." Dad didn't answer. Emily handed over the corrected receipt. Dad reached for his wallet. The man stepped closer, too close. Years in law enforcement teach you to recognize personal space long before violence begins. There's conversation distance, there's argument distance, and then there's the distance people choose only when they want control. He'd crossed into the last one. "You heard me, old man." "I heard you," Dad said calmly, inserting his card. "So move. I'll be done in a moment." "You people always think everyone else should wait." Dad looked at him the way I'd seen him look at stubborn students decades ago. "No, I think everyone deserves basic manners." Something flickered across the younger man's face. Not anger, but something closer to fear gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the hard mask he must have worn for years. As though someone had taught him long ago that backing down was never an option. He grabbed one of Dad's grocery bags and threw it to the floor. Apples scattered across the tile. A jar of pasta sauce shattered near Emily's register. Dad bent instinctively toward the mess, and the man shoved him both hands, deliberate, not wild, not accidental. Dad stumbled into a candy display, his shoulder catching the metal rack, the back of his head clipping the corner on the way down. Behind him, near the customer service counter, a man in a gray polo. The store manager's name tag read, "Paul Mercer," froze, mid-step, looked toward the fallen man, and then strangely toward the man standing over him. "Mr. Vaughn," he said quietly, almost to himself, before catching himself and saying nothing at all. I didn't understand that word yet. I would. Dad's cane hit the tile a heartbeat later. I was already moving before I realized I'd started. Retirement doesn't erase 30 years of instinct. "Dad, I'm all right." He wasn't. His breathing had changed, and when he tried to sit up, pain crossed his face before he could force it away. I steadied him gently, and studied everything else the way I'd been trained to the ceiling cameras, the guard who still hadn't moved the manager half out of his office, the customers finding sudden interest in their own carts, and the man standing over my father smiling again. Maybe next time he'll learn not to waste everybody else's day. I stood slowly. Anger is loud. Training is quiet. I let my eyes travel over him once, 6'2", athletic, right-handed, a fresh scrape across 2 knuckles. No smell of alcohol, no panic. He wasn't surprised by what he'd done. He expected everyone else to accept it. "You got a problem, lady?" he asked. "I'm giving you one chance. Stay exactly where you are." "And if I don't?" Chief Dalton, a Bellwood patrol officer, had just walked through the entrance, coffee in hand, and froze the instant he recognized me. The younger man's smile faltered for exactly 1 second before returning. "You don't work here anymore," he said. "No, but assaulting a 73-year-old man is still a crime." The officer hurried over. Before he could ask a single question, Paul Mercer stepped forward with the sympathetic, hollow expression of a man reciting a line he'd rehearsed. "I'm afraid there may have been a misunderstanding. I think your father simply lost his balance." Emily stared silently at her register, her hands very still on the counter. The guard adjusted his radio and looked away. One by one, every witness who had watched this happen lowered their eyes to the floor. The young man smiled once more. As paramedics lifted Dad onto the stretcher, he leaned down, believing only my father could hear him. "You should have accepted my father's offer." Dad didn't answer, neither did I. But in that single sentence, the entire afternoon changed. This had never been about a checkout line, and somehow watching my father wheeled toward the doors of the store his attacker's family had built, I understood that the real story had started long before either of us walked through those doors. The emergency room smelled like disinfectant, overheated coffee, and the faint metallic scent of rain carried in on wet coats. Dad sat upright on the edge of the hospital bed, his left arm strapped against his chest. 6 stitches hidden beneath a bandage near the back of his head, 2 cracked ribs making every breath look more painful than he was willing to admit. The doctor had already given me the words I needed most, no bleeding on the brain, and I held on to them while the rest of the diagnosis settled in. Dislocated shoulder, cracked ribs, mild concussion. "You look worse than I do," Dad said when I came back from speaking with the nurse. "That's because I've had to listen to you tell 3 different people you're fine." "I am fine." "You nearly passed out when they moved your arm." Poor technique. Even bruised and medicated, he could still find fault with someone's workmanship. I pulled the plastic chair beside him. His right hand rested on the blanket, fingers tapping a rhythm against the fabric, the same rhythm he used when measuring wood thinking through a repair. He only did that when he was worried. "Tell me about the offer," I said. His fingers stopped. "What offer?" "The one that man mentioned before the ambulance doors closed." He looked at the dark television mounted on the wall. "It's nothing. He pushed you hard enough to crack 2 ribs, then told you that you should have accepted his father's offer. That isn't nothing." The monitor in the next room beeped through a long silence before he finally sighed. "Vaughn Development wants the house and the workshop. My back acreage sits where they want the new access road." "How long have they been trying to buy it?" "About 8 months, 4 offers." "How many visits from Derek?" His gaze shifted to mine. "A few." That meant more than a few. My father never lied directly. He simply reduced the size of the truth until he could live with it. "Where did he show up? The workshop, the mailbox, once after church?" "Did he ever threaten you directly?" "He doesn't say much. He stands too close, smiles, asks whether I sleep well alone." "Did he damage anything?" A pause. "The workshop window broke last month." "You told me a branch hit it. It was windy." "It hadn't rained in 2 weeks, Dad." He gave me a tired look. "You always were difficult to fool. You never should have tried." The words came out sharper than I meant them. He turned toward the window and guilt followed immediately. He'd been attacked 2 hours earlier, and I was interrogating him because questions made me feel useful. I covered his hand with mine. "I'm sorry." "So am I." He was quiet a moment, then added, "I didn't tell you because I already knew what it would do to you. You'd have moved back in, slept in your old room, started running background checks on the mailman." "Would that have been so terrible?" "You have your own life, Maggie. I wasn't going to let a man like that take it from you, too." By the time we left, it was after 9. I drove home slowly, easing over every rough patch in the road, while Dad stared out the passenger window at the lights of Bellwood sliding past. I helped him into the recliner near the front window of the house where I grew up, white clapboard, worn hardwood floors, my mother's hydrangeas along the fence starting to brown at the edges. He still trimmed them every spring. He still talked to them on Sunday mornings. Neither of us had ever mentioned it out loud. Daniel Reeves called it 1030. He'd been a young patrol officer when I became chief and had taken over the department when I retired. I trusted his judgment, but something in his voice that night made me uneasy. "Come in tomorrow morning," he said. "Why not tonight?" "Because I want time to review the statements first." "What statements?" "The ones that don't match." His office still had the same narrow window over the parking lot, the same dent in the corner of the oak desk. The only real difference was a family photo beside his computer and a department portrait on the wall that no longer had me standing in the middle of it. He closed the door. "We interviewed everyone we could identify. No one says they saw Derek shove your father." There were 40 people near those registers. "The cashier says she was looking at her screen. The guard says a display blocked his view. Paul Mercer says Walter stepped backward and fell. Paul Mercer is the store manager. And Richard Vaughn's employee." There it was, out in the open. Vaughn Market wasn't just a name on a sign. It was the original business that had built the family fortune, the store Richard's father had opened 40 years earlier. Derek hadn't attacked my father in some neutral grocery store. He'd done it inside his own family's building, surrounded by people who depended on the Vaughns for their paychecks. "The cameras," I asked. "Register 4 and the front entrance were both offline." "That isn't a malfunction." "I know." "Then arrest him." Daniel leaned back. "Derek claims Walter moved toward him first. Without video or a cooperating witness, the DA says we need more. My father is 73 and walks with a cane. I'm not defending Derek. I'm telling you what I'm up against." He opened a folder and slid a single page across the desk. 3 months ago, a shop owner named Henry Bell reported that Derek threatened him after refusing to sell his property. The report never reached the prosecutor's office. It disappeared. Reports don't disappear. This one did. Only a handful of people have that kind of access, and at least one of them works inside city government. He rubbed his eyes. Vaughn Development is financing half the downtown redevelopment. Library expansion, parking, garage, road improvements. The city council has tied its future to Richard Vaughn's money. I didn't ask about the council. No, you asked why Derek is still walking around free. He looked at me steadily. That's why. I sat with that for a moment, not the anger of it which I expected, but the shape of it. This wasn't one bad man losing his temper in a checkout line. This was a system that had already decided, long before my father hit the floor, whose word would matter and whose wouldn't. I want the original incident reports from every property Vaughn Development has approached in the last year, I said. Not just Dad's, all of them. Daniel hesitated. That's not really your case to build, Maggie. No, it's yours. I'm just going to help you build it before someone erases it too. He didn't argue. Over the next several days, while Dad's ribs slowly allowed him to sit up without wincing, small things kept surfacing. A neighbor mentioning that the Morris's laundromat had sold suddenly last spring. A mail carrier remarking that Henry Bell's sporting goods store had gone dark almost overnight. None of it seemed connected yet. It rarely does until someone starts asking the right questions in the right order. Dad noticed me writing names on the back of an envelope at his kitchen table one morning. "You're building a case," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm making a list. Same thing with a different name for it." He eased himself into the chair across from me, moving with the stiff caution of a man who refused to ask for help. "Add Samuel Pierce." I looked up. "The surveyor, he came to me 6 months ago with something he found in the county filings. I told him to keep quiet about it until we understood what we were looking at." Dad's jaw tightened just slightly. Then he stopped answering his phone. That was the first time I understood my father hadn't simply been a target in all this. He'd been part of something already in motion, and he'd been keeping that from me too. 2 nights after I left Daniel's office, someone knocked on Dad's door well past 9. I opened it, expecting a neighbor. Instead, Emily stood on the porch in her work apron, still smelling faintly of the store, her son asleep against her shoulder, wrapped in a blanket too warm for the season. "I can't stay," she said before I'd even said hello. I told my sister I was dropping off soup. She stepped inside only far enough to pull a folded phone case from her jacket pocket hands, shaking slightly as she worked a small memory card free from behind her employee badge. "I filmed it. On my break 2 days before. I don't even know why I started recording. Derek was in the manager's office with Paul, and I didn't like how they were talking." She pressed the card into my palm like it was something that might burn her. "You can hear Derek mention my father-in-law's diner, and you can see Paul turn the Register 4 camera before he ever walks over to your dad. Emily, this could—" "I know what it could do." Her eyes were wet, but her voice didn't break. "I have a 4-year-old. I need you to have this somewhere safer than my phone." She was gone before I could thank her properly, her car pulling out of the driveway with its headlights off until she reached the road. I sat at Dad's kitchen table and watched the video twice before I could bring myself to call Daniel. Helen Morris lived in a modest ranch house outside Bellwood. Her flower beds carefully tended her curtains, drawn despite the bright morning. When she opened the door and saw me, fear crossed her face before recognition did. "I already sold," she said. "I know, I'm not here about the laundromat." "Then there's nothing to discuss." "There is if Derek Vaughn threatened you the way he threatened my father." Her fingers tightened on the door. For a moment, I thought she'd close it. Instead, she stepped aside. The living room was neat, but strangely bare, pale rectangles on the walls where photographs used to hang. On the coffee table sat a folder with Vaughn Development printed across the front. "I keep meaning to throw that away," she said, following my eyes. "What happened, Helen?" She sat on the edge of the sofa, hands folded like she was bracing for something. "At first, Richard sent letters. Very respectful, very generous. When I refused, Derek came to the laundromat himself, told me old buildings have electrical problems while standing right beside the fuse panel. No raised voice, no threat a court could quote. Just a suggestion placed beside something flammable. A week later, someone poured sugar into my grandson's gas tank. Then the fire inspector visited 3 times in 10 days. She looked toward the blank walls. I tried to report it. A young officer took my statement. 2 days later, the department said there was no record of it. Would you tell the state police what you just told me? Her eyes filled, though nothing fell. I have 2 grandchildren, Maggie. You had a badge. People listened when you talked. I had a laundromat and a boy who drives home after dark. I had no answer for that. Before I left, she touched my sleeve. Your father thought we could stop them. We met in his workshop, Walter Henry Bell, Samuel Pierce, and me. We compared what happened after each of us said no. She paused. Did he ever tell you what Samuel found? I drove home already knowing the answer was no. Dad was at the workbench. When I got back, turning a piece of sandpaper over in his hands, not sanding anything, just holding it. "You met with Helen and Henry and Samuel," I said. "You never thought to tell me." "We didn't have proof yet." "You had a pattern." "A pattern scares people. Proof protects them." He set the sandpaper down. "I learned that from you, actually." "Don't do that. Don't make this my fault for teaching you to be careful." He looked at me for a long moment. "Samuel found something in the county survey filings, boundary lines that had been moved after the original approval, just enough to make certain properties look necessary for the new access road. Forgery, maybe. I don't know enough about it to say for certain." "Where are the documents?" He rose slowly and crossed to the wooden cabinet against the back wall and stopped. The lower drawer hung open. Folders lay scattered across the floor. The lock hadn't been picked. It had been pried. The wood around the strike plate splintered outward in a clean, deliberate line. Dad crouched beside it, running his thumb along the broken wood the way he'd once shown me how to spot a bad repair job. "This wasn't forced with a crowbar," he said quietly. "Look at the angle. Whoever did this used something thin and flat, worked it in, slow popped the latch without splitting the frame. That's someone who's done it before. And they came straight here." He gestured at the workshop table, saw plainer a wall of hand tools that could fetch real money at auction. "Nothing else is missing. Not the equipment, not the register in the till drawer, just this cabinet. When were you last out here?" "Yesterday morning. It wasn't like this then." Which meant someone had come while Dad was lying in a hospital bed 2 miles away and known exactly which drawer to empty. "They knew where to look," I said. "They knew where I used to keep things." Dad crossed to the old rocking chair beneath the window. My mother's chair, the one she'd used rocking my daughter to sleep as a baby. One runner repaired so many times the wood no longer matched. He turned it over, removed 2 small plugs from the underside, and reached into the hollow runner. He pulled out a sealed envelope. "Your mother never trusted metal cabinets," he said. "She used to say locks only tell thieves where to look, so after Samuel gave me his notes, I moved the real copies out here." The folder they just tore apart was decoys, old invoices, old tax records, nothing that mattered. For the first time since the grocery store, I felt something other than fear or anger. Admiration maybe tangled up with irritation that he hadn't told me any of it sooner. Inside the envelope, photocopied survey maps, payment records, printed emails from Vaughn Development. One spreadsheet split property owners into 2 columns, cooperative and resistant. Helen's name sat in the second column. So did Henry's. So did my father's, with a note beside it. "Escalate after Friday." Another email from an address belonging to Richard Vaughn's executive assistant. "Derek is worried this is taking too long." His father reminded him that failure is not an option. I read it twice. For the first time, Derek looked less like a man who enjoyed cruelty and more like a son terrified of disappointing someone, which didn't excuse what he'd done to my father. It only explained why he'd pushed as hard as he had. At the bottom of the stack, a note in handwriting I didn't recognize. "If anything happens to check the revised highway access survey. The original was never legally approved. SP." "Where is Samuel now?" I asked. "I don't know. Helen thinks he moved away 3 days after he gave me this." "What do you think?" Dad's eyes stayed on the broken cabinet. "I think Samuel Pierce doesn't strike me as a man who runs from a fight, which means something made him." Before I could answer, glass shattered behind us. A brick rolled across the workshop floor and came to rest against the leg of the rocking chair, a sheet of paper rubber banded around it. I picked it up by the edges, already thinking about fingerprints that almost certainly wouldn't be there. One line printed in plain type. "Your daughter goes home or the next accident happens inside the house." I looked up at Dad. He wasn't looking at the note. He was looking past me out through the broken window toward the driveway toward his truck. "Maggie," he said very quietly in a voice I hadn't heard from him since I was young enough to need it. "Don't drive that tonight." "What?" "Just don't. Not until someone looks at it first." He didn't explain why not yet, but 30 years of trusting my father's instincts told me he already suspected something worse than a note wrapped around a brick, and that he was more frightened for me in that moment than he'd been for himself lying on that store floor. The mechanic found it before I even finished explaining why I was worried. "Someone's been under here," he said, flashlight angled up into the wheel well of Dad's truck. "Recently, look at this line." The brake line had been nicked, not severed, not obviously enough to fail in the driveway, but scored just deep enough that it would have given out somewhere on Route 9 on the long curve above the reservoir where Dad drove 40 miles an hour every single Sunday on his way to church. I stood in that garage for a long time before I could make myself call it in. The state police photographed it the way they'd photographed the brick. 2 investigators arrived that afternoon, one from financial crimes, one from public corruption, and for the first time since the checkout line, I felt something shift in my favor. Neither of them owed Richard Vaughn anything. "This isn't intimidation anymore," the older investigator told me. "Intimidation is a brick through a window. This is attempted murder, and whoever did it made a mistake leaving it half-finished." I should have felt relief. Mostly I felt sick picturing my father's truck coming apart on that curve with no one behind him to notice until it was too late. Over the next 2 weeks, the case built the way real cases build slowly in pieces, most of them boring, none of them dramatic enough for a headline. Financial investigators traced a chain of shell companies routing payments to a private security contractor. That contractor, it turned out, employed the same off-duty guard who'd been working the front of Vaughn Market the day Derek attacked my father. The same guard who'd looked away and found something else to watch. Samuel Pierce's name surfaced in a hospital record from 6 months earlier. A single vehicle accident on a rural highway ruled inconclusive, no witnesses, no citations issued. His truck had crossed the center line at a spot with no ice, no debris, and no reasonable explanation. He'd survived. His family had convinced him afterward that the safest thing he could do was disappear, and so he had into an assisted living facility outside Cedar Falls registered under his sister's name. He was still alive. That was the only fully good news I got that month. Then, just as quickly as things had started moving, they stopped. A judge declined to sign the broader search warrant investigators had requested for Vaughn Development's full financial archive, ruling the existing evidence too circumstantial to justify it. Without that warrant, the shell company trail went cold at exactly the point where it might have led straight to Richard. 2 days later, Emily called Daniel's office and asked to withdraw her statement. I went to see her that evening. She met me on her porch, arms crossed against the cold, her little boy watching cartoons through the screen door behind her. "Paul knows I gave a statement," she said before I could ask. "I don't know how, but he knows. He came by my new job, just to buy a coffee, just to say hello." Her voice was flat, the particular flatness of someone repeating something to convince herself it was survivable. "I have a 4-year-old Maggie. I can't be the reason Richard Vaughn decides my son doesn't have a mother." "You don't have to withdraw everything," I said. "You could just—" "I already gave you the card that night," she said quietly. "I did that because I believed it mattered. I still believe that. I just can't be the one standing in front of a camera saying it out loud anymore." I didn't try to talk her out of it that night. Some kinds of courage cost more than a person my father's age has any right to ask for, and Emily had already spent more of hers than most people ever will. The next blow came from Richard himself. He held a press conference on the courthouse steps, no lawyers flanking him, just Richard in a gray suit speaking without notes the way a man speaks when he's rehearsed something so many times it no longer feels like a performance to him. "I've built this town for 30 years, he said, according to the clip that ran that night. "I understand that a respected former police chief believes her family has been wronged. I understand grief can look for someone to blame. What I won't accept is a private citizen using old law enforcement connections to conduct what amounts to a personal vendetta against my family and my business." He never mentioned Derek by name. He didn't have to. By morning, half of Bellwood City Council had issued statements standing behind Richard Vaughn's contributions to the downtown redevelopment project, and precisely 0 of them had called my father to ask how he was healing. It was less than a day later that a local reporter fed a file by someone in Richard's camp, though it was never proven who ran a story about a use-of-force decision I'd signed off on 11 years earlier, as chief a case that had ended in a lawsuit the city quietly settled, and I had never fully spoken about publicly. It wasn't corruption. It was a judgment call I still wasn't certain even now I'd gotten right. I could have stayed silent and let the story die on its own the way most old stories eventually do. Instead, I asked Daniel to release the full file, and I gave one interview where I said plainly that I believed I'd made the wrong call that night, that I'd carried it for 11 years, and that a badge doesn't entitle anyone, including the woman I used to be, to avoid saying so out loud. It cost me the last of whatever polish former Chief Dalton still had in this town. I found somewhat to my surprise that I didn't miss it. Daniel called that afternoon, his voice carrying a stillness I didn't like. They suspended me. Administrative leave. Improper coordination with outside investigators. A pause. They're trying to remove me before anything else gets served. He came by that evening and set his badge on my kitchen table, not dramatically, just quietly, the way you'd set down something heavy you'd been carrying too long. I don't know how to fight people who don't need to break the law to win, he said. They just need to make it look like I'm the one who did. Dad found me at the kitchen table past midnight, staring at nothing in particular. You should sleep, he said. So should you. He lowered himself into the chair across from me, wincing at the ribs. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. I want you to stop, he said finally. I looked up. Dad, I mean it, Maggie. They tampered with my truck. Emily's terrified. Daniel's out of a job protecting evidence he found because I asked him to. I have watched 2 people I care about get hurt trying to help me. And I am not going to sit in this kitchen and watch it happen to my own daughter. His voice caught just slightly in a way I'd never heard from him, not even at my mother's funeral. Your mother spent 30 years waiting for you to come home alive every night you wore that uniform. I won't spend what time I have left doing the same thing. I understood sitting there that I had a choice to make that had nothing to do with evidence or warrants. My father was asking me to protect him by stepping back. And for the first time in this entire fight, I wasn't certain that stopping wasn't the right thing to do. I can't promise you I'll stop, I said quietly, but I can promise you I'll be careful. That's the only thing I have to give you right now. He didn't look satisfied. He didn't argue either. We sat with that unfinished disagreement between us the way we'd sat with disagreements our whole lives, neither of us willing to be the one who gave up ground. It was Richard who called next. Close to 1 a.m, his voice as calm and polished as it had been on the courthouse steps. Ms. Dalton, I believe this has all gone far enough. You should have thought about that before your son assaulted my father. A quiet, almost amused sound. You still misunderstand the situation. I never told anyone what to do, Ms. Dalton. I simply made sure they understood what success looked like. I don't think that's much of a defense. It's not meant to be a defense. It's meant to be an explanation. His tone never rose. I'd hate for anything else unfortunate to happen to people you care about. Your father's truck, for instance. I understand that was a very close call. My stomach turned cold. He hadn't confessed to anything. He never would. That wasn't how men like Richard operated. He simply made sure I understood exactly how much he already knew about my life, in a voice a jury would never be able to call a threat. If you touch my father again, I said, there won't be enough distance between you and what happens next for your lawyers to find. Words matter, Ms. Dalton. They certainly do. The line went dead. I sat in the dark kitchen a long time after that, turning over everything. I now understood that Richard had built a life on never having to say the dangerous thing out loud, that everyone around him, Derek Paul, the guard, the counsel, had learned to do the saying for him. And that somewhere in the last 2 weeks, without quite meaning to, I had become the only person left in Bellwood still willing to say it back. Richard's phone call stayed with me all night, and by morning I understood why. It wasn't what he'd said, it was what he hadn't. Men like Richard rarely make threats you can play back in a courtroom. They build enough distance between themselves and the damage that someone else always ends up holding it. Derek threw the shove. Paul turned the camera. Someone in accounting routed the payments. Someone at the county moved the survey lines 14 feet to the east. Richard just kept smiling 3 steps removed from every ugly thing his money had ever paid for. That distance had protected him for 30 years. It was about to become the thing that finally ended him. 2 days later, Richard held a second press conference, this one smaller, no cameras invited, but the ones that showed up anyway. A reporter asked him directly whether his son had acted alone in the Vaughn Market incident. My son, Richard, said choosing each word the way a man chooses which brick to remove from a wall he's still standing on, has always struggled with impulse control. I've encouraged him to seek help. Whatever happened in that store was not something I authorized, condoned, or was even aware of until after the fact. It was a good answer. It was also, we later learned, the first time Richard Vaughn had ever put daylight between himself and his son in public, and Derek watched the clip from his own kitchen alone 3 times. The next morning, Vaughn Development's legal counsel sent Derek a short letter clarifying that the firm represented Richard Vaughn and Vaughn Development Corporation, and that Derek should retain separate personal counsel for any matters relating to the incident at the Bellwood location. Derek's own name co-founder the letterhead used to read had quietly disappeared from the firm's public materials sometime in the last week. 4 days after that, an assistant who owed Derek a favor let him see something she probably shouldn't have, an internal memo drafted for the board describing an isolated incident involving an employee acting outside the scope of his authorization exhibiting concerning behavioral instability unrelated to company policy or practice. Employee, not son, not heir, unstable, unauthorized. Derek read it standing in a hallway of the building his grandfather had built, and understood all at once that his father had already decided which one of them was going to prison. He called me that evening. I almost didn't answer. "My father is going to let me take all of it," he said before I could speak. No arrogance left in his voice at all, just something flat and exhausted. "The camera, the offers, Paul, even the truck. He's going to say I did it all on my own, and the lawyers are going to help him say it because that's what lawyers are for." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want to talk to him, in person, somewhere he doesn't get to control the room." A pause. "Your father's workshop." I hung up and called the state police financial investigator directly. "He wants to confront Richard in Walter's workshop," I said. "I think Richard will come if he believes it's still salvageable, a private settlement, a quiet ending. But if we do this, it happens through you, not through me." They agreed faster than I expected. Within an hour, a recording device had been fitted discreetly into an old radio. Dad kept on the workbench shelf. His idea, not mine. He'd built the housing himself out of a cigar box 30 years ago and knew exactly how to hide a wire inside it without anyone noticing the seams. 2 unmarked vehicles would wait a quarter mile down the road. I was told plainly 3 separate times, "Don't lead him. Let him talk. Whatever he says. It only matters if it's his." I understood sitting in my father's kitchen that night that everything that happened next would need to stand on its own, because by that point, the case against Richard Vaughn no longer depended on a single conversation. It depended on all of it, together the altered survey maps Samuel had risked his life to expose. The shell company payments traced to a security contractor, Paul Mercer's signed statement about the camera, Emily's video still safely with the state police, Samuel's own testimony finally given from a hospital bed 6 months late, the spreadsheet from the rocking chair dividing neighbors into cooperative and resistant like inventory. And now whatever Derek was about to say to his father, one more piece, not the whole case, but the piece that would lock every other piece into place. Richard arrived the next afternoon in a dark sedan, dressed like a man attending a settlement meeting rather than a confrontation, which I would later understand was exactly what he believed it was. He carried a leather folder under one arm. Derek followed several steps behind him the way I now realized he always did, not beside his father, behind him. Richard stepped into the workshop and looked around slowly, the hand tools arranged by size along the wall, the workbench worn smooth by 40 years of use, the way a man appraises a property he's already decided to buy. "So this is where Walter builds half the furniture in Bellwood," he said. Then to Dad directly, "I understand my son wants to discuss terms." He set the leather folder on the workbench and opened it. Inside a settlement agreement, a non-disclosure clause, a formal withdrawal of any civil claims against Vaughn Development, and a check with more zeros than my father had earned in his last 5 years of teaching combined. "I came here to end this properly," Richard said, quietly, "before any more of us say things in public we can't take back." "You came here to buy my silence," Dad said. "I came here to be generous." Derek spoke for the first time since walking in. "Tell him what you told me, Dad, about the store." Richard didn't look at his son. "I don't know what you mean." "You told me people like Walter only understand consequences. You told me to make the resistance end without involving you." Derek's voice shook just slightly, but he kept going. You said the camera, the offers, the inspections, those were tools. I was supposed to use them with restraint. For the first time since I'd met him, Richard Vaughn went completely still. I gave you one responsibility, he said quietly to his son, and for a moment it seemed as though he'd forgotten anyone else was in the room. Make it end, quietly, without ever making me say a single word about how. Nobody spoke. Outside, gravel shifted under tires. Richard's head turned toward the sound, and something in his face relaxed, certain his own attorneys had finally arrived to close the deal he'd come to make. They weren't his attorneys. State police vehicles filled the driveway. Investigators stepped out with the arrest warrant. They had already spent 2 weeks building a warrant resting on survey fraud on wire transfers, to a security contractor on a corrupted police report on a turned camera, and now finally on a father's own words, said aloud in a room he thought he still controlled. Richard looked at me. You arranged this? No, I said, looking at his son instead. He did. Derek didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man who had just watched the only life he knew end, and had decided at the very last possible moment not to go down defending it. I'll cooperate, he said. Richard didn't answer him. For the first time in 30 years, by every account, I later heard Richard Vaughn had absolutely nothing left to say. 6 months later, Richard Vaughn faced charges of witness tampering, extortion, and conspiracy to commit fraud, with an additional count of criminal tampering with a motor vehicle pending the truck. Prosecutors argued having been sabotaged at his direction, though that piece would take another year in court to fully resolve. Derek pleaded guilty to assault and testified against his father in exchange for a reduced sentence. Paul Mercer took a plea deal of his own. Daniel stayed on as chief. Reinstated by then, his suspension quietly withdrawn without apology. Samuel came home for good walking with a limp he'd carry the rest of his life, but home. Emily kept her job and her son, and though she'd once withdrawn her statement, the state police still had the video she'd handed over that first night, enough in the end that she never had to take the stand herself. None of them got their old lives back exactly as they'd been. Most people who tell the truth about someone like Richard Vaughn don't. Your mother would have made you do that, even if I hadn't already had my ribs cracked to prompt it. Dad told me when it was over. She never trusted anyone who was more careful with their reputation than their mistakes. Dad's shoulder healed slower than he ever admitted, and his ribs still ached whenever rain was coming. But most Sundays he still walked out to trim my mother's hydrangeas, and most Sundays I still let him. One evening I found him in the workshop, running his thumb along the handle of his old hickory cane, the same one that had cracked against the floor of Vaughn Market the day this all began. He'd carved 6 words into the handle since then, small enough you had to know to look for them. Stand firm when others choose fear. He set the cane down beside my mother's rocking chair and walked out through the workshop door without it, one hand trailing along the doorframe for balance instead. Outside, the hydrangeas were just beginning to bloom again. For the first time since that Friday afternoon at Vaughn Market, I let him walk ahead of me. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who believes courage doesn't have an age limit.